Welcome to Moments with Marianne. Allow me to interrupt your train of thought with something that may be one of the most interesting things you hear today. This is Marianne Pastana, and our special guest today is Helané Wahbeh. She's the author of The Science of Channeling, Why You Should Trust Your Intuition and Embrace the Force that Connects Us All. So Helané is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, otherwise known as IONS. So let's welcome to the show, Helané Wahbeh.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. You know, as a clinician, you're a research scientist. Did you ever envision yourself writing a book on channeling?
Absolutely not. In fact, this part of my life, because I have a personal history of channeling, was really quite hidden and not something that I talked about with other people. It was only until I found a research institute that supported exploring these esoteric concepts that I felt like I could come out of the channeling closet, if you will, to be more vocal about channeling, what it is, the science that's been done on it, and how we can use it to support our daily lives.
Well, it seems that, exploring consciousness is something that's been in your family's blood, right?
Yes. Amazingly, this type of experience, what I call channeling, I experienced as a very young child. And my mother took me to a meeting at my grandparents' house when I was 10 years old, where they were doing something called trance channeling, which I can explain a little bit more about. But my whole mother's side of the family had some type of channeling skill, if you will, and that allowed me to feel comfortable to nurture it personally. Like you mentioned, my grandfather did write a book and spent his life researching these types of things as a hobby, if you will. He was a surveyor and would survey during the day and do his work on the evenings and weekends. And every member of my mother's family, like I said, had some channeling capacity. So I think it might be useful at this point to explain what I mean by channeling, because many people might not understand what I mean by that word. So the way I'm defining channeling is this process of accessing information and energy that's not limited by our conventional notions of time and space, and that this experience can be expressive and it can also be receptive. And so what does that actually look like? Channeling experiences show up on a very broad spectrum, from intuition or gut hunches that everyone might say they've experienced at one time or another, ranging all the way to things like mediumship and trance channeling that are perhaps more rare. And things in between might be like sensing the future or being able to know a place at a distance in your inner mind's eye. There's a huge, wide diversity of channeling experiences. And so when we poll people about if they've had these experiences, they're actually quite common. And we did this incredible survey with almost 900 people. There were 3 groups: scientists and engineers, enthusiasts from our listserv, and also people from the general population. And we found that over 90% of the people endorsed at least one of 25 channeling experiences. So one of my major motivations for writing this book is to educate people about how common these experiences actually are and the real science that has been done about them.
Well, thank you for taking the time to break that down, because I think a lot of people get confused with some of the terminology. And when we talk about channeling, it's from your book that I've been reading, it's that connection that we all have. Can anyone channel, or is it just for a few select people?
So we propose at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where I work, and this research is being done along with a lot of other researchers around the world. But we propose that all humans are born with an innate capacity to be able to channel, to tap into their intuition, if you will. And there are many studies that are showing us that this is likely true. We just finished a genetic study, actually, looking at people who were very strong in these experiences compared to age, gender, and race matched controls, or people who don't have these experiences and who also don't have them in their family history. And we found that there was a very interesting genetic component in the non-coding region of the DNA that was present in the people who had the experiences versus the people who didn't. So there was a unique difference in their DNA. And what was so fascinating about this finding was that the version of the gene of the DNA that was in the people who had the experiences was the original gene, if you will, and that its expression in our larger population is related to the increase in technology and the spread of Christianity. And so, these experiences have been in our, distant past been persecuted. And so there was perhaps a selection to not have these channeling experiences. And you can imagine that as technology has increased, our need to rely on our intuition to perhaps find the group of buffalo to find our next meal may not be so important, and being able to use our intuition to navigate or direct us may not be as important if we have our smartphone with our GPS system on it. So these are just very early findings, and we're looking forward to looking into that more deeply, because many people do say that the specific types of channeling experiences run in their families. When we look at just tuning in or tapping into our intuition or getting gut hunches or feeling goosebumps when we, feel a truth, if you will, most people will say that they have had those types of experiences. And what we're trying to do is explore the different types, perhaps how they work. Do some people have certain types more than other people's? And if they choose to, how can people nurture these experiences to help them in their daily lives? We see that people use these for decision making, for very practical uses. And so exploring them, I think, can really help support people live more easeful lives.
Well, and I really appreciate the scientific research that you're doing with this, because a lot of times you have people who are just, very grounded in what they would call reality. And they're like, well, there's no scientific proof of this. And I felt your book offered so much.
Yes, that is a really big aspect to why I feel there are so many taboos about this topic. And also why people are afraid to mention their experiences with others. I've done so many talks and interviews about this topic, and invariably I get messages, or when it was in person, people would come up to me and, whisper that they've had this experience, but they can't tell anybody. So people might wonder, well, why are there so many taboos about it? Why do people not understand the research? The fundamental reason for this, I believe, is because of our model of how things work right now. So the dominant paradigm or what thinking about how things work is based on materialism, which means that the fundamental nature of reality is physical. It is things that we can materially touch around us. So that is in contrast to what we experience in channeling. Just to give you a clear example, someone might be doing their dishes after dinner, and then all of a sudden they get an incredibly strong impression of their mother and feel anxiety, if you will. They call their mother, find out that mom has just fallen and has been taken in an ambulance to the hospital. So this is an example of a clairvoyant or maybe even a telepathic experience that I would consider channeling. So a materialist might hear that story of the person doing their dishes and getting this impression of mom and say, well, that's just totally impossible, because there's no way that you could at a distance know what was happening with your mom, because we're all separate and all that is real is the material. What we're finding now through many fields of science is that materialism, while is very useful, doesn't actually explain everything in our universe. And there is a new paradigm arising called post-materialism. And in this paradigm, consciousness, or our awareness, if you will, is not limited to our physical brain and our physical body. It actually can extend and perceive beyond our physical brain. We're not quite sure how that works yet, and yet we see this over and over again in the laboratory and also in daily life, like this person doing the dishes. So when you envision our consciousness, our awareness being more diffuse or more able to experience things at a distance, then this idea that this person could get information about their mother doesn't sound crazy. It actually fits within a model. Now, what is that model? I know this is getting a little intense, but in terms of the physics, there's a very unique set of experiments around this idea called entanglement that's offering support for this non-local consciousness, if you will. So imagine taking two photons and entangling them in some way, and then taking one photon and taking it to the completely opposite side of the country, so thousands of miles away. When you change the spin of one of those photons, the other photon instantaneously changes to the same spin. So there's no gap in time, even though these photons are thousands of miles away. So these entanglement experiments have been replicated over and over again with a variety of different objects. They even found quasars that were over 12 million light years away from each other. The light from them was entangled in some way. Don't ask me how the physics of how they figured that out, but it was quite incredible to see that. So we're getting this evidence from quantum physics, from cosmology, that these non-local phenomenon are actually real. And so this experience of knowing somehow that mom has fallen makes a lot more sense in terms of our worldview.
Well, I am so just impressed with that research. And it's exciting because, a lot of times when people had experiences like even 10 or 20 years ago, it is basically like, your family would have to consider maybe getting you a padded room. And now there's so much being talked about when we talk about channeling. I think that it's so empowering for a lot of people.
I agree. I think it is empowering. You're right, because many people are afraid to share about these experiences because they are associated with mental health, psychopathology. And so We have done ourselves numerous studies, and many researchers around the world have also looked at this exact question. Do people who have channeling experience also have mental health pathology? And overwhelmingly, the research shows that in general, most people who have channeling experiences do not have symptoms higher than what would be considered abnormal. So what do I mean by that? There's two mental health conditions that people most think of when they think of channeling. One is dissociative disorders, where you're basically disconnected from yourself. The other is psychotic disorders associated with schizophrenia, hearing things, seeing things that other people don't see. So if you perhaps hear some guidance, you're at a stoplight, the light turns green, and you hear a word, stop, saying, don't go. And then all of a sudden there's a car accident in front of you that would have been you if you hadn't heeded that word stop in your mind. That could be considered a psychotic symptom, hearing voices that other people don't hear. So how do you distinguish between channeling experiences and true mental health conditions that people need support for? So what we found with people who have channeling experiences is that for the most part, they may have higher symptoms on our questionnaires than people who don't have regular channeling experiences, but that the level of symptoms that they have is well below any clinical cutoffs that a mental health provider would be concerned about. Now, this is a general rule. Also, most people who channel say that they experience very positive impact from their channeling experiences. They are high functioning. They're able to, happily go about their lives. They have high quality of life, etc. That's the general rule. I want to highlight that there are rarely people who are bothered by the channeling experiences, meaning that they are very strong, they're very intense, they happen all the time. It blocks them from experiencing a normal, functional daily life, and they have negative emotion around it. It's stressing them out. And so in this case, I advise people, and I talk about this in the book, that in those cases, that's where it's important to reach out for support. And that is kind of the main distinction, if you will, to be able to discern if your channeling experiences are healthful, intuitive experiences, or if you may need some support and get checked out by a mental health professional. Is this piece of, are you functional? Are they adding to your life? Is there a positive emotion around it?
There seems that there should be some discernment if someone's really going through a mental health issue, or if they're channeling for the first time and maybe they're not sure what to do.
Yes. And I think it's also important to speak to the mental health professional, because perhaps in the past, without an awareness of normal, healthy, functioning channeling experiences, there would be a tendency to overdiagnose that the person does have an issue. But there is a very big trend now in multiple arenas in psychology to bring awareness to these experiences so that mental health professionals can treat or not treat people and support people around this more easily. Some people might also seek support from spiritual counselors. And so there's the need for spiritual counselors to also be aware of this, so that instead of downplaying it as a spiritual emergence, if you will, if the person really needs help, that they can actually get help from a mental health professional. We talk about that. I talk about that in the book, and I just published a paper recently with a colleague about that exact issue, just bringing awareness to functional, healthy channeling versus when the person actually needs help. There's an interesting group at Yale who's also doing work around this, around hearing voices, and what is, a channeling experience of hearing a voice that's not harmful in any way and is functional, if you will, versus hearing voices in the context of schizophrenia or a mental health illness.
Well, I think it's so powerful to bring everyone to the table, because then we are saying, hey, okay, we've got this information. These are some guidelines to go by. And perhaps not everything is a mental health issue. Perhaps it's, someone who's having a channeling experience.
That's right. Absolutely.
So do you ever get people that say, gosh, I'm afraid to channel. I know I can, but I'm afraid to do it because I'm just not sure what I'll be channeling?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And it brings up an important point around trance channeling. So sometimes when people hear the word channeling, they think that I'm only speaking of trance channeling. So what is trance channeling? In trance channeling, the channeler believes that they are acting as a vehicle of communication for a being that is non-physical. So maybe many of the listeners have heard of various trance channelers, John of God or Esther Hicks, and the channeler's experience is that they are actually not doing the speaking, that there is usually benevolent, non-physical being that's speaking through them and using their voice box, if you will, or in automatic writing, using their hand to write. And so these are more rare and unusual channeling experiences, and usually embarked on through choice and training, if you will. And when people hear the word channel, it's like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have some being, whether it's a real being or my imagination speaking in a weird voice, etc. And so my experience personally, and just from all the people that I talk to, that in general, trance channeling is something that is trained and nurtured. Usually if someone has a first experience of that, that's not chosen, that it just comes upon them, that they quickly embark on a path to nurture and support their channeling ability. But for the most part, it's not a spontaneous experience to do trance channeling. What does happen more spontaneously are things in people's daily life, like I expressed about the dishwashing and, getting an impression of a person, or perhaps walking into a crowded room and feeling really overwhelmed by people's emotions around them, feeling people's emotions very strongly, or perhaps having a dream of something that might happen in the future, and then it does happen, a precognitive dream. So these are many of the various ways that people spontaneously experience channeling in their daily life. And for the most part, they often have some functional purpose, either to guide or to inform, to give information. And many of the stories from our over 500 people that we polled about this, there's some element of survival or, protecting from danger, if you will. So back to your question about people feeling afraid to channel. I think that's very natural when we're facing something that is unknown. I really invite people to create their own path. There is no one right way to channel, no one right way to learn to channel. So if people want to learn to channel and yet are afraid to, my invitation to them would be to start very, very slowly. There is one strong predictor that we've seen many times in numerous studies that supports people in channeling experiences, and that is meditation. So a very simple way to practice channeling, if you will, is to start a meditation practice where you sit quietly, you relax your body, you still your mind as much as possible. And then if it feels comfortable to you, one of the first channeling exercises I suggest for people is to just ask a question internally. Should I, have this meal for lunch, or should I have this meal for lunch? And then to sit quietly and see what you feel in your body. If there's any thoughts that come to you, see if you experience a contraction or an expansion. That very simple exercise, I think most people find very not scary, if you will. It's about really tuning into our internal wisdom. In our society, we're so externally focused, looking at the phone and email and social media, so many things around us that, while can be very useful, detracts us from any information that we might be receiving internally. So at its base core, that's what channeling is about. It's about going within to access our inner wisdom, or what we call our noetic wisdom. Noesis is from the Greek word meaning inner wisdom. So how do we tap into our inner wisdom? And that's what channeling is all about. So back to this thing of fear, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that fear and to sit with it as best you can. Perhaps if people if they're afraid but also want to learn, is to try these simple exercises and perhaps even reach out to a community of channelers who are already doing it and receive support, get their questions answered, and have a nurturing container to support them upon their path.
Well, I know in your book, you also talk about discernment. And I think that that's such a huge piece, because a lot of times you hear that people just get the information and there's not really, sometimes they'll just share it without like accountability or discernment. It's like, should I be saying this? Should I not?
Yes. There's a few ways that discernment comes into play around channeling. One is to use channeling to actually discern. So, you might have thought my example about choosing what you're going to eat for lunch was perhaps silly. And yet, what if before we put anything into our mouth, we actually tuned into our bodies to see if it really wanted it? Perhaps that would support our health in general. So many, many people use channeling to support them in making choices. Of course, our intellect is so useful, and making lists of pros and cons is really excellent and fantastic. And yet adding this intuitive wisdom to help us make our choices, I have seen in my own life and in every person I've talked to around channeling, it has made their lives more easeful. Instead of banging their heads against the wall along paths that may not be working for them, they're able to choose things in their lives that really support them. There's another aspect of discernment that I think you were perhaps alluding to, was this, idea that there's so much channeled information that we see out in the world. And many people will project their authority on that. Oh, if it's channeled, it must be true. I do not prescribe to that at all, and really suggest that people use their own intuition about, is this channeled material useful to me? people keep, definitely focus on this idea of, well, is it true? Is it real? Is it not real? There's only so far we can go with the tools that we have today to be able to prove, in quotes, if the information is real or the sources are really where the channeler says they're coming from. And so until we have those tools, I suggest to people to focus more on if the information is actually useful to you in this moment. And so if you read some channeled information, I would invite you to get quiet, get still, and ask, is this information useful for me? Is there something in here that I need to implement to support me in my life, regardless of what the source is or where it comes from? Is there some nugget in here that can really help me? And that's how I personally wade through the channeled material that I come across and suggest for other people to do as well, to not just take it as truth at face value.
Yeah, to really kind of sit with it and investigate it. And I really appreciate that because, my goodness, we've got so many people, like you were saying, that it's like, oh, I channeled it. It's 100% true. So we have to do A, B, or C, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for most of the studies that I have seen, there's still the filter of the channeler's mind. So let's say that we could prove that a discarnate being is communicating through a channeler. Let's just say that we could prove that. It's still coming through the channeler's mind in some way. And so we still don't understand how that filter works. There's much talk in the channeling community about the ego mind stepping aside, and yet they would still need to be using the channeler's mental capacity to communicate what they need to communicate. So it's fascinating questions to explore.
If we're channeling, in many ways, it's like, how do we know what we're getting? Unless we really kind of have a little bit more knowledge, I would think.
Yes, that's true. There's been fascinating channeling studies with people who, let's say the channeler just speaks English and they go into a trance channeling state, and then they start speaking a language that they don't know. That's one of these unexplainable experiences that have been well documented for over 150 years. It's quite fascinating. So in that case, you might say, well, how could that happen? Because it's not in the person's mind. Anyway, it's a little bit of an aside, but the human experience of channeling is so diverse and varied, and I think quite individual. And that the way channeling experiences show up for people, we call that their noetic signature because it is unique to them. Each person experiences it in a different way. They might feel it in their body. They might get things mentally. They might see things. They might hear things. And I think that part of that, back to, what started this conversation, is what has been called the library of the mind, and the person's education, their worldview, their filter for seeing the world, that influences their channeling experiences and how they receive it and perceive it.
I know there's a lot of positive benefits with channeling, and this, science is just talking about that. How does it support our well-being?
I've alluded to this piece about decision-making. It was fascinating. We saw this over and over again in our research surveys, that people would talk about using their channeling to make decisions, and that when they did that, their life became more easeful. So that's one major piece. Another is protection. So we had so many stories about people who either heard a voice or got a feeling that stopped them from taking some action that then protected them. There was one nurse who would do house calls, and she was arriving at her next patient's home. It was actually an apartment building. And she got a very strong feeling not to go in and heard a voice saying something like, "Don't go now." And it was so strong that she didn't. She got back into her car and did the next person and circled back around. And when she finally arrived, found out that there was a huge altercation in the lobby of this apartment building, and that got quite violent. So that intuition, if you will, protected her. There were numerous stories about avoiding car accidents from a sensation or an inner voice. So that's another aspect, is just protection, if you will, listening to those inner warnings. When we look at surveys around the world, this isn't just with our surveys, and people ask, how have these experiences impacted you? Overwhelmingly, the impact is positive. These channeling experiences, for the most part, have a positive role in people's lives. In Brazil, where these type of experiences are more common and integrated into their culture, there's also a social benefit, because being a medium or a channeler in their culture provides some social status as well. So there's that aspect of it also.
Does it impact our brain at all when we channel? Is there any kind of good vibes we get from this, or calming effect?
Subjectively, what we see in the surveys is that people are healthier and have a healthier quality of life. There have been, you asked about the brain, there have been a number of studies looking at brain waves, or EEG, during various different types of channeling experiences. And what we found is it's generally similar to what we see in meditation. For the most part, there's an increased alpha and theta. There haven't been as many EEG studies in channeling as there have been in meditation, so it's still not completely clear, but we have seen some shifts to a more, so alpha and theta would represent a more relaxed and alert state in alpha, and theta is more like a relaxed and trance-like state, if you will. There haven't been enough long-term studies, as far as I know, in terms of physiology. Many researchers have also looked at different hormones in the body, looked at EKG or heart waves. Some studies show a relaxed state. Other studies show a more aroused state, like in trance channeling. Many studies have shown that people are more in a sympathetic nervous system activation, which is more related to fight or flight. So we've gotten some mixed results on what's actually happening in the body during channeling. At our lab, we did a study with trance channelers where we had them go in and out of channeling states, and we looked at brain waves, heart waves, skin, blood pressure, breathing, and voice. And the only measure that we saw that was different was the voice. We did this frequency analysis of their voice when they were reading a story, when they were in a trance state versus a non-trance state, and we saw a distinct difference. Now, your question also leads to this piece around, well, how does channeling work? And the short answer is we're not really sure, and it likely depends on the type of channeling. But we live in these bodies, and we feel sensations in them that are very aligned often with channeling experiences. So this idea that our body is a tool in some way to be able to receive this non-local information, I think likely has some validity. And there is a set of experiments that were done that supports that. It's called DMILS, DMILS, which stands for Distant Mental Intention of Living Systems. And in this study is so fascinating. You take pairs of people. So imagine we have one pair, and one person is called the sender. And the sender sits in a room, and they have a TV in front of them, closed circuit TV. And their partner is the receiver, and they're in a totally separate part of the building in an electromagnetically shielded room. Both of the people are connected to electrodes that collect information from their body, brainwave, heart waves, skin, breath. And what the sender sees on the screen is a picture of the receiver. And the picture of the receiver will come up for a certain amount of time, and then it'll go away. So when their picture comes up, the sender focuses their positive intention towards the receiver. So as I mentioned, in a materialistic paradigm, there's no reason why the sender sending their positive intention to the receiver should do anything to them, right? But in a post-materialistic paradigm where non-local consciousness is valid, perhaps there would be some shift in the receiver. And what we see in these studies, and there have been many, many of these studies done in different labs all over the place with many different types of physiology, brain waves, fMRI, etc., is that the receiver's physiology changes instantaneously when the sender is sending to them.
So I know sometimes people say, well, I'm channeling, but I don't know if it's just my imagination or not. I mean, how would we respond to that?
That's a great question. And many people are very focused on what is the source? What is the source of this information? And when you think of general channeling experiences, like some that I've mentioned, telepathy or knowing the future or remote viewing, many of these make a lot more sense when we imagine that we are all interconnected, that our consciousness is non-local, that we're seeing evidence for through quantum physics. So this separation of space between the person doing the dishes and their mother is non-existent in that model. So it makes sense. When we think about trance channeling in the sources, people have many different ideas about what the sources are. The most commonly believed source is the person's actual higher self or their higher consciousness or even collective consciousness. And, some channelers and mediums would say, oh, it's an actual deceased person or an actual discarnate being. And that may be true, but at this point, we don't have all the tools to confirm that definitively. In terms of mediumship, there's been incredibly rigorous triple-blind studies demonstrating that mediums can get information about deceased humans that they couldn't possibly know in any other way. And yet we can't prove if it's actually a deceased person or if they somehow picked it up through some other psychic or channeling ability, even though that would be quite incredible in and of itself. So when I am asked that question about what is the source, when I get to the core of it, like I mentioned before, does it really matter? Of course, we're curious. Of course, we want to know. And yet at this point, we can't definitively know one way or another. So I suggest to people to focus more about the content and if they find it useful rather than it being the source. And then if people push, then I say, well, if you take this idea that we are actually all interconnected, that we are getting so much evidence for through our sciences that we are all interconnected, then whether it's your higher self or connected consciousness or a deceased human, etc., it's still all part of the same thing. And I want to just back up a step. So I don't want to just gloss over this idea, because I think people do get concerned about, well, where is this coming from? And they can have fear around it, or they don't necessarily trust it. Like, is it coming from my ego mind? Is this, where is this coming from? And they feel worried that it's going to be harmful in some way. And so that's where this concept of discernment comes in again. It's like, okay, well, what was the information that came through? Is this, if I acted on this, would this harm me or someone else? Or would it actually help me in some way? And to use that information to support them if they can. And if it doesn't resonate or it doesn't make sense to follow through on, then just let it go. And to invite yourself, and I do this for me too, to invite myself just to be in this open state of curiosity and not necessarily needing to know one way or another. I will tell you that I am committed to finding the tools and the measures to be able to discern what the actual source is, but we're just not quite there yet in terms of the science to be able to definitively say one way or another.
Well, I can't wait for that research, because everything that you've been unfolding here is really exciting. And I think a lot of people are going, okay, I've been kind of a channel, that's been in the closet. So what are some ways that they can express to maybe their friends and family that they are channeling, or is there any discussions that could be had about that?
That's a great question. I invite people to be, I don't want to say cautious, but gentle. I think gentle is the right word. And I often, if people start asking me about my work or my experiences, I may, depending on who the audience is, start with the word intuition. Most people know that word. They've had some intuitive gut hunches, and ask questions more than talk at, have you ever had an experience where blank, blank, blank? And, based on our surveys, probably 8 to 9 out of 10 of the people you talk to will have had some intuitive channeling experience that they can speak to. We want to be having these conversations to bring the reality that these experiences are common much more to the forefront, normalize them, allow people to share about them, and put less focus on trying to prove whether the experiences are real or not, but actually start doing the real work of discovering how it works. What are the different permutations? Can we train them? Can anybody learn them, and how to actually use them in our daily life? I mean, our world is so crazy right now, so incredibly crazy, and we need all the resources we can get. So regardless of the source, could we actually use these intuitive capacities to help us make wiser decisions as individuals, as communities, and globally to help humanity on this planet that is in such intense times right now?
Well, Helané, I mean, my goodness, your book was such a resource. I thought I knew a little bit about channeling, and I learned a lot. So I really, really enjoyed reading your book. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
They can go to www.noetic.org, noetic.org. That's the Institute of Noetic Sciences website. We have free webinars, can get on our listserv, receive our science blogs and alerts. We have all of our peer-reviewed publications and various projects on there. And you can even participate in some of our research studies as well, if you will.
Well, Helané, thank you for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, Helané, it has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Science of Channeling. The Science of Channeling is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And of course, remember to support our indie bookstores. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.